I'm super, super excited to be here with everyone. And thank you, Jack, for this opportunity. Jack and I have run into each other time and time again on the speaking circuit. And I'd say maybe it was almost 2 years ago at this point, Jack approached me and said, I like what you do. We have tons of amazing opportunity within Datassential to be tapping into, the wide audiences for insight learning. What can we do together? And I came back to him a bit later and said, well, I'm writing this book. I would like to be able to run an original study that's taking a lot of these theories that I've developed over the last many years of research and look at it qualitatively and quantitatively, both together at the same time. And so that's what we're going to be walking through for you today. Next slide.
Next slide.
So this is my book, Hungry, which came out about a month ago. That was the culmination of about 5 years of research internationally looking at what the impact of technology has been on global food culture. And it has a particular focus on millennial and Gen Z food culture, largely because we are the generations that are most significantly impacted by what I call the digital age, meaning life post-iPhone. If you can believe it, the iPhone only came out in 2007. But it has drastically changed the way that we view our own self-worth, the way we interact with other people, the time that we spend throughout our days. It's really remarkable to look at studies showing how many times we open up our phones. We talked about that briefly before we came online. Really, I don't think that any one of us does a habit more frequently except breathe. So it really has had a massive impact.
That will actually say that we are already cyborgs at this point, because we're basically attached to our phone and it's sort of part of us.
Right. It's an appendage. It's like an external organ. And then we have the Hungry study here, which is a separate document that we created together with an awesome team at Datassential. We ran an original study of 1,100 individuals across the United States, across demographics, location, age, race, everything. Some of the findings are integrated within the book of Hungry, but in full transparency, we found such amazing stuff that we were like, we need to package this and make it available. So the Hungry study is available at thehungrybook.com, and the Hungry book itself is also available for sale, but we'll be showing you some of the original insights today that came out of that investigation, and also talking about not just the impact of tech, but now, what's the impact of COVID on all of this? Next slide. So just to give you a very broad overview of the introduction, people today are obsessed with food. And you all likely know this because this is the industry that you live and breathe every single day. But millennials and Gen Z really are the top foodies in the world. It's really important to keep in mind this is 51% of the global population. And oftentimes people talk about Gen Zers and millennials as like this alien population that is just kind of throwing a wrench into the normal way of doing things. But this is just people now. The vast majority of the people that we polled within the Hungry study labeled themselves as foodies, but by far and away, Gen Z and millennials take the cake as the foodiest of them all. I began my research into this about 12 years ago when I was living in New York City, getting my master's degree in writing, completely broke, yet spending what little discretionary income and time I did have on food and food experiences. And I began to wonder why it was that I was doing that. And then I looked around and said, why is everybody else my age also doing that? I wrote my first book on it, which came out in 2015. I then received calls from people around the world saying, this is not an American trend, it's global. And since that period of time, I've been lucky enough to travel around the world and observe this. So just to kind of start things off with a bang here, we see this photo of this young woman wearing this t-shirt. I came across her while in Bangkok on the SkyTrain and asked if I could take a photo of her t-shirt. The cold brew there, that photo is from Yangon in Myanmar. That's a country that is the poorest in Southeast Asia. They only recently received access to the internet. My husband and I visited 2 years ago, walked into a coffee shop. They were actually roasting the coffee beans there on premise. We were handed a coffee flavor wheel, asked which notes we would like our coffee to embody, and I chose this icy, cold, refreshing, sublime cold brew with flavor notes of cherry cola and lemon citrus. Next slide. So during this time, I haven't just expanded what I'm looking at beyond the US and beyond millennials. I've also started to look at how is this showing up in other areas of lifestyle. So yes, I'm looking at, well, why are we obsessed with superfoods, biohacking, things like that? But I've also found that what I'm looking at relates and speaks to also our interest in things like mindfulness or goat yoga or houseplants and meditation. Continue. Next slide.
Ask a question about biohacking. We actually had a biohacker present at our Foodscape event a couple years ago, and I found it to be super fascinating. Could you take a moment and just share with everyone what that actually is and if you think there's a future in that?
Biohacking, for sure. And actually, I'm going to ask you, Jack, can you put up the questions about phone attachment too?
Yeah, let's actually do that. Let's see.
So biohacking is essentially people who are tracking their macros, and I got to be perfectly honest, I don't even know what the macros are looking at is 100%, but it's, measuring the protein and carbohydrates and sugars that you're consuming every day. And really the theory of biohacking is if you can control all of the inputs that you're putting into and onto your body, you can control the outputs, how much energy you have, how long you will live, whether you or not you will get sick, your mental agility. So people who biohack are often also attracted to things like intermittent fasting. That's a mode of biohacking. Bulletproof coffee is something else that goes in there. CrossFit. I'm trying to think of other, like the cryotherapy is another big thing for biohackers. What am I missing? So, nootropics is another big one.
Yeah, and so if all you have is, let's say, a Fitbit, you have not fully crossed over into biohacking yet. That's sort of like the gateway.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have the phone question. I do have the polling question around anxiety and what causes you the most anxiety. Which habit? Is that the one that you want me to pull up?
Yeah, we can do that. Sure.
Yeah. So let's actually do another poll. The question here is, which one of the following, for you personally, causes you the most anxiety during the day?
Okay. So while folks are answering that, I'm going to kind of continue talking through the slide. So could you stay on the previous? Yeah. So part of what I began to realize as I was going through my research on the why people are obsessed with food is I had to reckon with the fact that my generation in particular, those who were driving this foodie culture, especially in the, around between 2008, 2011, I think is really when that foodie culture was percolating. We are also the guinea pigs for lives tethered to screens. And that attachment to screens is something that I don't think enough people are really focusing on. But around that period of time, there began to be a conversation in the area of psychology of a true and deep anxiety that was starting to plague people. And they called it nomophobia, which is the fear of not having or not being able to use your cell phone. So there's actually now a proven nomophobia scale that is used by researchers and psychologists. We sent out a bunch of these nomophobia questions in the Hungry study, and we didn't diagnose people with nomophobia. We came up with our own scale of deciding who we were going to call tech tethered, who are truly, truly attached to their screens. And what we decided is that those who agreed with at least 5, so 5 of these statements they had to agree with, we were going to put in the tech tethered cohort, and that was 57% of our respondents. So that means they had to agree with at least 5 of these statements. I find myself wasting time on my phone, but find it hard to break away. When I have a moment alone, I find myself reaching for my phone. When I wake in the morning, one of the first things I do is reach for my phone. I think that actually on the Hungry Book website, you can take the nomophobia quiz for yourself down at the bottom.
You can say almost 60% of Americans are tech tethered.
Yes,
essentially.
For sure. Yeah, and then the picture there is actually on the subway in Seoul.
On that nomophobia thing, I have this thing that I think maybe other people do too, where sometimes I think I hear my phone ring and it doesn't, or it's in my pant pocket and I think I feel it vibrate, but nothing was actually there.
Yes, that's called ringxiety.
Ringxiety?
Anxiety or phantom vibration syndrome.
I can't believe there's terms for that. So yeah. I guess it's a real thing. All right, so let's see. You're
not alone.
So what should be the number one source of anxiety?
I've actually never asked this question before. This was inspired by one of your ideas. So I would say, uh, checking email.
Let's see. And this time, I think we beat Eve. So
Wow. Well,
this could be a
okay.
moment in time, though, given what the
Yes.
current news cycle is.
Yes. Yes. Reading the news, absolutely. I agree. That's true. Consider,
I'm
yeah.
part of that 6% that trying to figure out what to eat for dinner every day is like crazy anxiety for me. It's like, what if you make the wrong choice? What if someone gets angry at you because they don't like their meal too? I don't know. But I struggle with that because I feel like that's something that I have some control over, and it's my fault if I screw it up. Right?
That's fair, except that like the consequences are really not very high.
Yeah, but I think we do that as people, don't we? Don't we sometimes like catastrophize
Yes.
about things? So
Yes.
maybe that's just my version of it.
And actually, I mean, we can get into this, but this also has to do with paradox of choice, right? Nowadays, there's just
Yeah.
so many things to choose from that we feel as though we need to optimize our choice, which leads to paralysis.
Yeah, that was a great book. Was it? I think I read that book back in like the late '90s. Was it Barry something or other? Yeah,
Towards,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That was great. Basically, when you have too much choice, you can't do anything.
yep.
It's sort of like Netflix. I spend more time flipping through Netflix than I do actually watching Netflix, which I think
Yes.
is probably common.
And I do have a section of the book in Hungary that goes into paradox of choice because I think that limiting choice is going to be a trend that we're going to see. And I made that prediction prior to COVID, but especially now that we are in this age of severe anxiety, I think that that's going to be even more relevant as we move forward.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. Okay, so not that this is like great thing to be talking about, not super uplifting. I know reading the news itself is depressing, but it turns out we were already stressed out, anxious, depressed, and lonely prior to the COVID pandemic. And I began to uncover this as, again, I was looking into the why behind these food and lifestyle trends. And I began to question, well, okay, how is our relationship with technology driving a lot of these emotional maladies? And how are these things interrelated with one another? Next slide. So in order to answer that, I needed to do a bunch of research on well-being. And that's really what the last 4.5 years for me has been focusing on, is doing an evaluation, looking at different theories by psychologists, neurobiologists, religious leaders. I know super, super interesting to do this analysis and find that overall, theories on what makes us feel well, what makes us flourish, really fall into these 3 buckets. So the first one is we all need to feel safe and in control. We all need to feel as though we're a part of a community, that we belong. And the last is we need to feel that our lives have meaning and purpose. And these 3 things are what shape the Hungry book, the Hungry study, and as the slides that we're going to be going through today. Next slide. So most of my work, again, has been focusing on how is the digital age impacting our ability to meet those well-being needs, and how is food culture reflecting that. Now, of course, we're looking at it also through the lens of COVID-19. How is COVID-19 impacting our ability to meet those well-being needs, and how is that showing up in food and lifestyle culture right now, but also what are we able to predict for the months and years to come, which is going to be super, super important to be considering. Next slide. So first things first, we all need to feel safe and in control. This is a quote from Abraham Maslow. He is considered the father of humanistic psychology. He really was the first person to look at not what makes people crazy, but what makes people flourish. And he says that the average adult needs to or prefers a world that is safe, orderly, predictable, lawful, organized, kind of the opposite of the world that we're living in now. Next slide. But it turns out that people were already anxious prior to this moment in time. In fact, anxiety levels are shockingly high, particularly among millennials and Gen Z. And we found this replicated again in our own study. You'll see up there, the top part there is 60%, but well over half of the Gen Zers and millennials that we polled, and over half of Gen Xers were saying that in general, their anxiety level is high.
And we should note that these are pre-COVID numbers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
these were fielded prior to COVID.
Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons why people are anxious today. In part, it's the climate crisis. It's still reeling from the 2008 recession. It's student loan debt. But there's also an obvious impact of our lives in the digital age. Just as we saw, right? Reading and watching the news makes us anxious. Part of my research over the last few years was talking to evolutionary psychologists about this. And what they told me is our brains simply did not evolve for a world where you know all the bad things that are going on all the time, right? We evolved to live in our tribes where we knew about the bad stuff happening with the 150 or so people around us. And then maybe like the neighboring tribe, like if they got sick, we needed to know that so we could avoid them. But our brains literally cannot handle the amount of news, be it good or bad, that's coming at us.
So this is literally blame it on the internet, right? That was the explosion that unleashed all this information on us.
Yes. And here I have the bad news cycle. It's not just that we have access to it, it's that actually the platforms that we use to access our news are crafted in such a way to make us continue to click and obsess over bad news. And I'll go into why exactly that is in a couple of slides. But the other thing here that I do want to quickly point out is the impact is not just knowing about bad things that's making us anxious, it's also time, right? So checking email is another thing that causes anxiety, checking social media. A lot of the work that I was doing was actually looking into time spent, and we are less productive when we are spending so much time checking our phones, checking notifications, when we're constantly distracted. And it's leading to things like burnout and exhaustion. They even have a term for this in Japanese that's karoshi, which is death from overworking. Next slide. So we actually saw this relationship between technology and anxiety in the hungry study population. So this pink line that you see there is the general population response to I frequently or sometimes worry about, this wide variety of things here. So everything from food safety to climate change and terrorism. People in general, again, quite anxious. But one of the groups that was more anxious than the general population on every single one of these was those who are most attached to their devices. And actually, Jack, can you go back one slide? I just kind of want to go through that circle really quickly. So what happens when we feel anxious and out of control, when our natural state to well-being is to feel safe and in control? We try to make ourselves feel powerful in some way. One way to try to make order out of the chaos is through knowledge. So let's say you watch something on the news, you receive a notification, it's something that's upsetting. Our natural inclination is to gather knowledge. We actually get a hit of dopamine when we learn something new because it's part of our survival instincts. So, okay, you open up your app, you're then going to look and read through more news because you want to gain knowledge about it, because you think it's going to make you feel better. So then we interact with these algorithms that show us more bad news because they say, hey, Jack's really interested in learning about the numbers of people who are dying from COVID in Italy. We're going to give him more stories like that. Then you're exposed to even more bad news stories. Then you feel even more afraid, which then causes you to want to take control even more, and it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So like if, I'm on YouTube a tremendous amount of the day. It's my number one media source by far. And, you look at the recommendations again, and every now and then I'll log out of YouTube and just get like default YouTube without any algorithm recommending anything to me. And just, you actually sort of see like, oh, this is what the world actually looks like before I'm into this like crazy tunnel vision thing that's happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So you can skip the next slide and go on to the next. You can go, perfect. So we try to create order out of chaos. So creating knowledge, not creating, but gaining knowledge is one way that we try to put ourselves in the driver's seat. But food culture today is reflecting the general anxiety that people are feeling. something that I have heard time and time again during interviews with people is they'll say, well, I have no idea how my phone actually works, even though it's an appendage. I don't know if my city is going to be underwater in 50 years. I do not know hardly anything. People feel, generally speaking, quite out of control. There's also very, very low rates of trust in government institutions and big business. And so what happens when we feel super anxious is we try to take control. And what folks are saying is, at the very least, I should be able to control what it is that I am eating. It's a decision that we get to make 3 times a day, and food is becoming this vehicle of control. Next slide. So one way that this desire for control is showing up is through transparency. Demand for simple ingredients, for tracking, for blockchain. I was able to see a version of this firsthand in China, where I visited Hema, which is the grocery store chain that's owned by Alibaba, which, if you're not familiar, is basically the Amazon of China. It's actually much bigger than Amazon. The Hema grocery stores are based on this idea of transparency. So at the top, you'll see there's a woman there who's literally netting her own shrimp. The sign there says, please use net for the aquarium. So it's catch your own, essentially. And you can even request to have it then cooked for you based on your desires on the way out. But every single product in the grocery store has a QR code associated with it. You can then open the Hema app, which is what my translator is doing in the bottom GIF there. She was scanning a tank of crabs. She scanned it, and in seconds, I found out that those crabs had been flown in from Canada 2 days prior. I then also received recipes on how to prepare the crabs and advice from other people on how to store it, what tastes best. And that is the type of thing that people are gravitating towards. Next slide.
I think that has an application at restaurants eventually, learn more about your dish type of thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's part of why people are gravitating also towards farm-to-table restaurants, things that are in season. It's foods that people understand. It also has to do with getting to know the restaurateurs, right? Or the chefs, wanting to see the chef make your food, wanting to talk to the chef. Part of this is about, community and belonging, which we can talk about in a bit. But another part of it is just like, I want to know who's feeding me. Just like that basic thing. And a quick anecdote on that point of I want to know who's feeding me. It's something that didn't make it into the book, but was a neat experience in Beijing. I was eating dinner one day and saw that there was a screen up above me that was a live feed video of what was happening in the kitchen.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Okay.
Yeah, but so this is also showing up, I just want to make the point, this isn't just happening in China, right? It's really, really big in China in large part because of food fraud and anxieties around food fraud. But this same trend of people wanting to have control over their food is happening everywhere for a wide variety of reasons. In part, it's because of rates of obesity and diabetes, right? The number one thing that causes death in the United States is heart disease, which is by and large caused by the foods that we eat. People are feeling like I need to have more control over my own well-being, so I want to know what it is that I am consuming. Again, it also just has to do with people being anxious in general and just wanting to be able to control something. Non-GMO, this is something that comes up in conversations often with my own clients. They say, what the heck is up with the non-GMO movement? I was able to dig into a ton of research around this topic in the book, but essentially, people don't want GMOs because they don't understand them. And
it's a scary word, but the G is scary sounding.
G is scary. Exactly. There was a really, really interesting study, though, in Italy that put labels on foods that said, this has GMOs, and people were more likely to buy it if it just had that label. Because having the knowledge that there were GMOs in it was somehow making people feel more safe. So,
but the label said this item has GMOs, and more people bought it when the label was on there than when it was not?
Yes. It's called an illusion of control. So it's the same thing as a label that says natural. That means nothing. But it makes people feel better.
You can put a label on something, even with something that's perceived as negative, and the fact that there's more information, that makes you feel better about the item?
Yes. In this case, yes.
So can you do like a menu item that says like this item is loaded with calories and just so that they know?
I mean, for some people, yes, that's actually going to be like, oh, okay, I know what I'm eating. I'm going to indulge in this moment. And I think that also, so what the researchers found in Italy, and this was a very small study, I should caveat with, but what they found is that because a company was willing to say this has GMOs, it made the person think that the company trusted the product enough to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because one of the questions, that restaurants have had is what happens when we put calorie counts on our menu? And we've heard some people say, well, this scared me away from that item because I don't want a 1,500 calorie salad.
Yeah. And for,
Your thought is that other people said, okay, now I know what it has, and at least I'm making that decision, so I'm going to go
yes.
ahead with it anyways.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
Depends on the person, depends on their mindset, but yes.
Really interesting.
Another way that people are creating order out of chaos through their food is by taking on restrictive diets. This is a theory that I had developed many, many years ago when I talked to a young woman about her transition into the world of food. And she very quickly told me about her past history with an eating disorder. And I asked her, I was like, well, but now you work in the food world. How do you deal with that? And she said, well, she's not anorexic anymore. She's like, but I only eat local and organic food, and it provides the same sense of control. I just thought that was super, super interesting. I had very similar conversations with a number of other people in the research phase for this book. I also was able to talk to the person who founded the Celiac Center at Columbia University, who was able to talk to me about the psychological role of limiting food choice. So this is not to say that we are a generation of disordered eaters, although perhaps we are, but this is to say that people are using food to create a sense of order. So it helps people to be able to say yes and no to things. You're creating structure. So if you are, say, paleo or vegan, this also speaks to paradox of choice. You can look at a menu and you're just going to eliminate things right off the bat. And it's helping people feel less anxious.
So if someone can say to themselves, I'm actively restricting something, that gives them like a sense of agency.
Exactly.
Is that a majority of people feel that way, or is that a small minority? I mean,
well, so this is kind of one of the defining features of a eating disorder, is using food as a form of control. It's been very interesting. One of the people I talked to about this has been in treatment for her eating disorder for a very long time. And she said that she's actually found herself trying to control other things. So like she's become obsessive with like her calendar and misses that sense of control. But yes, in general, even if you're doing it for health reasons because your doctor told you to do this, it's still giving you a sense of agency over your own health and well-being.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay.
All right, so we saw this play out in the Hungry study. Again, the Hungry study is looking at the impact of tech on well-being and how that's reflected in the way that people eat. So it's really digging into the why behind the biggest food trends that we're seeing. So I talked to you guys before about the fact that the tech-tethered group, the people who are most attached to their devices, were more full of worry than the general population. But there was another group there were even bigger worriers than the people who were attached to tech, and those are the pro-social dieters. So pro-social dieters were any of the respondents who said that they were limiting something in their diet, be it GMOs or sugar or gluten. But this cohort was significantly more worried about things like food safety, water safety, and the climate crisis. But they ranked above tech tethered on every single count. I think they tied with worries about debt.
Are these people that are just worried about stuff, they're just sort of, can you call them just warriors, or are they sort of warriors that are actively trying to do something about it?
That's a good question. So the pro-social dieters, I would say, are warriors who are trying to do something about it.
Yeah, got it.
We also have a separate measure in the Hungry study of people who said that their diets give them a sense of control. So we explicitly asked that question as well. So you can also see how those people respond in terms of worries.
Yeah.
But so, part of what we also want to talk about today is the context of what's happening. What does this all look like in the era of COVID-19? Again, you are seeing these well-being needs playing out in people's relationships with food. So at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, people tried to gain a sense of agency by hoarding. People wanted to have enough food. Victory gardens were another part of this, right? People are saying, I'm just going to grow my food. I want to figure this out. Sanitizing, another big part of this. Less food waste is showing up in every single survey that I'm able to find on it. People are becoming far more aware of their waste, but I also think that it is a tactic of control. It's figuring out to use what you have at home so that you go to the grocery store less often.
I can totally relate to this. On the sanitizing thing, I was doing that too early on. I was wiping everything down. And I even said to myself, I know this is probably doing absolutely nothing, but I'd feel stupid if I, got COVID and I did nothing about it to prevent it. So it was basically, I was just sort of covering my own ass mentally, essentially. And
Exactly.
I realized I was doing it and I was still doing it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that there's things like that that are going to continue to be true ongoing. And I think that actually the immune boosting, the research at Datassential as a part of the Hungry study, but also separate from it, has seen a rise in comfort foods and immune boosting foods. Both of those, so though it's counterintuitive, both of those are metrics of control. So comfort foods are people saying, life feels out of control. I want to feel comforted by memories of the past, things that are just viscerally lovely to experience. And so we reach for a bag of Doritos or a hamburger. But immune boosting is the same thing. People saying things are out of control. I want a sense of agency. I'm going to try to take control of my health and well-being. So I'm going to focus on gorging on turmeric and ginger and garlic.
Yeah, it's actually funny because, I'll buy some of those like juice shots and it'll say like, stress relief or something. I'm like, I know this thing is not relieving my stress,
But you
but
want it anyway.
yeah, but I buy it anyways. Yeah, because I feel like I'm making that choice still, even
Yeah.
though I don't totally believe some of those claims.
Yeah. And then also if you get sick, you can say like, oh, actually, I tried.
I tried. Yeah, exactly.
All right, next slide. All right, so the second super important well-being need is to feel like we're a part of a community, that we're loved, that we love others, and that we belong. This is a quote from Brene Brown, the relationship expert that a lot of people are super, super obsessed with. But she says, we're biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. And when those needs are not met, we don't function as we were meant to. Next slide. So one of the major trends that I have seen over the last decade in talking to people is extraordinarily high rates of loneliness. And we saw this reflected in the Hungry study. So 65% of the general population agreed that they wish they had a stronger community. That number went up to 75% among millennials. And then we also, so I plucked some questions from the UCLA loneliness scale, which again is a validated survey that is used in psychology communities. And I took out a few of those questions, and one of them was, if I wanted to go on a day trip, I would have a hard time finding someone to go with me. 49%, so half of the general population, agreed with this, and 56% of millennials agreed with it. And there's a lot of reasons why we are lonelier today. In part, it's that people are moving away from family. We are less likely to be attending religious institutions. We have moved into a culture of meritocracy where we're focused on, who has the corner office and what did you score on the SATs and how many likes did you get. But we're less likely to know our neighbors, to know the community around us, and to be living close to family and friends.
I think the stat that we've used in the past is even, prior to COVID, 92% of time spent in this country is spent indoors.
Yeah.
I think in the UK, it's like 93%.
Yeah.
That number has obviously went up even higher over the last few months. But people just aren't outdoors anymore, just systemically.
But Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, prior to COVID, said that loneliness was and is going to be the biggest health issue in the United States. There are not just psychological, but physiological ramifications of being lonely. And I'm not going to get into that here, but if anyone wants more information on that, I'm happy to share it with you. The other reason why people are lonely is counterintuitively because of social media. Now, we're in kind of this bizarre experience right now, and Jack and I, we were talking about this as people kind of came onto the call, but Right now, social media is a friendlier place. We are all kind of collectively suffering and grieving together. A lot of the posts that we're seeing are useful tips and tricks. It's people, sharing ideas on how to bake sourdough bread, what kind of meals you should be making, how to start your windowsill scallion garden. There is much less gloating, much less performative action. But generally speaking, social media is a place to gloat and to try to bring in likes. What we have found time and time again is that those who are most connected on social media are also the likeliest to feel lonely. So I talked to a number of different researchers about this while I was doing research for the book, but then again, it showed up again in the Hungry study. So here you see the general population as the pink line. This is people who say that they're desiring a strong community, think their friends are more successful, feel left out. And those in our study group who had over 500 Instagram followers, they were more likely to essentially report higher loneliness. So a lot of these were from the loneliness scale than the general population. But what you see reflected here is not just loneliness, but also lack of self-esteem. Yeah. And, there's really interesting things like it turns out that taking a selfie actually lowers your self-esteem. It doesn't raise it. And part of this is because people feel lonely for maybe one reason or another. They then feel as though they're going to get the validation that they want by going online and getting likes. But it turns out that likes are fleeting. It's not the same thing as a hug and a deep relationship. And one of the researchers that I talked to said, it's Apple Jacks versus apples. We need the apple to actually gain the nutrition, but we're in a world right now that's chasing after Apple Jacks, assuming we're going to get the nutrition of an apple. And in the context of COVID, we don't have the chance to have apples, so we're just, gorging on our Apple Jacks and dealing with it.
So we have a world, or at least a generation now, where we're addicted to these activities where if you're successful, it actually makes you less happy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Well, but it also depends on how you're defining success. And I think for especially the Gen Zers who I spoke with, a lot of their definition of success does come from likes or comes from Snapchat streaks. And what was so interesting, this is just a short anecdote from the book, but I asked these students, I went back to my former high school and spent some time there. And I asked them, how many people do you talk to every day? On social media, via text message, on the phone, in person. And they said the average was 30 people. And then I asked, how many people really know you? Yeah. And I put it as, how many people, if you came to someone and said, I killed someone by accident, would say, where do you want to put the body? How many people love you that much? And the answer was generally one or two people.
Yeah, and it's funny. I wonder if that's why it seems like every week or every couple of days you hear of another, famous YouTuber or Twitch star or Instagram star that's committed suicide or something. Yeah. It seems at a much higher rate than the general population within that group.
Yes. Next slide. So one way that people are coping with the sense of loneliness, I'll just touch on this, is by following influencers. So I went to Korea and shadowed a mukbang BJ. She live streams herself having dinner every single night. And she has about 200 people that watch her eat dinner every night. And then there's 2 hours of conversation after. And she called her followers her family. She lives away from her actual family. This is a way for her to find connection and meaning. And in the Hungry study, we do ask questions about influencers. And we found that a big number of people say that they'll do something illegal if asked by their influencer of choice. People feel like if something bad happens to their influencer, they feel like it happened to them. So it's kind of this artificial one-sided way of forming community and that sense of love in your life. But another way that people are doing that is by joining, essentially, diet tribes. So, before I talked about a lot of these things, a lot of these restrictive diets as ways of control, they're also avenues to profound community. So for book research, I actually went to a vegan speed dating event in New York City. it was super, super interesting to talk to people about why they were there, why a vegan speed dating event. It was interesting to also talk to the founder about the tension between the vegans and the vegetarians that attend the speed dating events.
So I actually want to double click on that tribal thing, which is really interesting, right? So, I mean, you mentioned before that in the vegetarian community, vegans are viewed differently from other vegetarians.
Yes.
And it seems like we're in a world now where everything's tribal,
Yes.
and each tribe keeps further subdividing in
Yes.
some way. Right?
Yes.
It's that old proverb, right? Isn't it like me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my brother and my cousin against the outsider?
Yeah.
And that's sort of happening all around us. And internet and social media seems to be expediting that
Right.
entire process.
So it goes back to evolutionary psychology and like what we evolved for, because we evolved to be in a group of 150 people.
Yeah.
That were all reliant on one another for survival, right? And you had to kind of winnow down your group of people who believed in the same thing as you in order to have that kind of camaraderie and survival. And today we don't have those communities baked into our existence anymore. And so we're trying to find them. And a lot of the time we're finding them online. So one of the people I talked to for research he was doing at the time his PhD on the paleo community, but specifically on Reddit. And he was telling me about like the infighting within different kind of sects of paleo dieters. You know, some people will, I don't even know what they would eat, but like, let's say potato flour or something. And there would be arguments essentially saying, you know, you're not really paleo. And I asked him, I was like, so it's like the Catholics and Protestants? And he was like, exactly.
So it's interesting. That means we will continue to just subdivide,
Yeah.
right? And it probably means that there will be more and more and more specialized diets over time, I would imagine.
Yeah, as long as there's a conduit to continuing to find that community, I believe that is true. And again, it has to do with like figuring out your value system and associating yourself with that value system. So I often hear from brands like, how do we get people to post about our product? It's like, well, if your brand represents a value system that someone wants to identify with, then they're going to use your brand essentially as their own branding opportunity on social media to express themselves. Yeah. And it's the same thing that's happening with these diet tribes. So we are going to continue to winnow down. I'd say the opposite here is that there's also opportunity to create a really large, vibrant tribe around one idea or two ideas, a strong value system, which goes back to the conversation we were having about sustainability, climate smart eating. I do think that major topics like that, where you need a lot of people to participate, they have the opportunity there to create a new tribe.
Yeah. I mean, I think the lesson, if you're a restaurant or a food manufacturer or a retailer, don't do a long-term strategy around a very specific diet, because they could just subdivide or morph. But if you go after a way of thinking or a lifestyle attitude or just a general approach to food, and you do something long-term that can support lots of diets that will emerge within that realm, that seems to be a better play. Otherwise, yes, you're just going to obsolete yourself as these things subdivide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Next slide. So the way that this was showing up in food culture and lifestyle culture prior to COVID was in things like boutique fitness retreat. People wanted to get to know their fitness instructor and see the same people all the time. People were living with one another. I guess it's still happening, but wellness retreats, shared meals. Next slide. So we're running out of time. This is also showing up in our culture right now. Obviously, people are trying to find ways to cultivate community. If anyone has ideas for me, tips on how you guys have been cultivating community, I would love to hear them in the chat or afterwards. But you know, even Netflix has a new feature so that you can watch your movie in tandem with a family member or a friend who is elsewhere.
Oh, they have that cool thing I think they're trying to put in this thing where you can watch it at like 1.5 speed too. What? That's the thing. Like a lot of people watch like YouTube videos and stuff at like 1.25 or 1.5 speed, so you could watch more in less time.
Oh gosh.
At that speed, you could still understand what people are saying. It sounds high pitched, but now you're getting pushback from Hollywood saying, you know, our directors are telling us, please don't allow Netflix to do this because it ruins the art.
Yeah.
film. But frankly, there are probably some documentaries I wouldn't mind watching at high
On,
speed and
on
just get through
super.
it faster.
Yeah. More knowledge, right? More knowledge, more
More
power.
knowledge, yeah.
Yeah. The last need that we all have is to feel like our lives have meaning and purpose. Next slide. There's a number of different ways for us to find meaning and purpose. This doesn't mean that you need to go join Doctors Without Borders. You can find purpose in your lives by achieving something new, gaining mastery in a skill that you feel really independent on. And this could be like learning to knit a scarf, learning to bake sourdough bread. I don't know, putting together a great flower arrangement and bringing flowers over to a friend. That alone can fill you with a sense of meaning. Next slide. But a big part of meaning building, what at least that I found in my research, is entering a state of flow, really losing yourself in a project. And those kinds of projects, yes, it can happen on a screen. I personally enter a flow state when I'm writing. But the processes, the habits that are most likely to be satisfying to us are actually ones that we can hold, that are tangible, that are physically shareable. That are stimulating all of our senses so that we are fully immersed in it, not just with our eyes or with our fingertips, but with our whole being.
So if I could ask a question about meaning in food. So it seems like if you go way back in human evolutionary history, food probably had a lot of meaning, not beyond sustenance. It was probably some sense of community and also maybe, I don't know, sense of achievement or accomplishment that you even have food, that
Oh
you
my
had a
gosh,
bit.
absolutely.
We don't have that anymore, right? Because now you can just go to the store and pay $1 and get a hamburger or something.
Well, but this is also why people say if you picked the food or if you harvested the food yourself, it tastes better.
Yeah.
That's true.
So if you were, let's say, a restaurant or a retailer or a manufacturer, how would you infuse meaning into food, right?
Yeah.
Like some of that stuff that we've lost over the past 100,000 years.
Well, so this also speaks to the trend that we've seen over the last 10 years of kind of the B corporation, the do-gooder products. And I always tell my clients that you can't just have a product that does good but tastes bad. You need to have a product that is delivering on those other basic needs. So it needs to be fulfilling people's desire for control. So either it's going to be really comforting and tasty, or it's going to be healthy and meet some other health need or a convenience factor. Then the brand needs to ladder back to that person's value systems and represent it in some way. So like Red Bull does a really good job of doing this, just as like one
Yeah.
example. But then if that brand also does good in the world, so let's say like Patagonia or Swell, you're going to have a leg up on your competitors who are also meeting those other needs. And that means that this purchase is giving back in some way.
Do you think the notion of taste as something that's really important to us, is that a more recent development in human history? Like, were the early Neanderthals, were they like arguing about, hey, this does not taste very good, I don't
It's
want
a
to eat that?
it's a privilege to worry about
Yeah.
taste. And there's a lot of Americans who are going hungry that are not going to be picky about the flavor of
Yep.
things. Or they are in part because the foods that they're eating are so amped up on flavor that when they're eating something else, it's striking them even more harshly. But no, I think that we live in a world where we have choice, and that in itself lends itself to being just pickier.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're running out of time a little bit, but one of the other ways to create a sense of meaning is by spending time in nature. And we found in the Hungry study that this was reflected. So the pink line in there is the general population, and these were questions about meaning in life. This came from a scale called the Life Satisfaction Scale. And these questions are: I'm looking for something that makes my life feel meaning, or seeking purpose or mission in life. I'm uncertain about my goals in life. And first, those who are attached to technology were more likely to be seeking a meaning and uncertain about their meaning in life. And that's for a wide variety of reasons that we could spend a whole other hour talking about. But interestingly, there was another cohort that was less likely to be seeking meaning or uncertain about their life's meaning. And that is the cohort we've identified as the IRL cohort, those who are living in real life. And the criteria for those individuals is that they spend at least 45 minutes a day outside. You were just talking about this, Jack. They spend at least 3 hours a day making things with their hands, and they're able to identify at least 3 wild local plants, which we took as an indicator that they are at one with nature. So we are seeing the reflection of this search for meaning in food and lifestyle culture. Again, with the rise of tech, we've also seen the rise of DIY culture, an obsession with analog. On the surface, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but when you take our well-being needs into it, it makes perfect sense. We're all looking at screens all day. That's not what we do well. Right, and this is also has to do with the rise in adult coloring books. So I would say, you know, after this presentation, get offline and go dig your hands in a bowl of dough or take a walk outside. Next slide, please. And this is again showing up in food and lifestyle trends. I thought it was so interesting, especially when I was in Asia, the number of like cat cafes and meerkat cafes. I actually went to a sheep cafe. There was like an actual sheep outside the cafe, but like that's the way that people are experimenting and involving themselves in nature, even when they're in an urban center. But you know, we've also seen a rising interest in gardening and foraging. Millennials are actually the leading buyer of edible seeds. We don't own houses yet. We are the ones who are gardening.
Are we seeing more tech-tethered people becoming IRLers as a result?
Yes, totally. And how this is showing up during COVID, again, it's baking. It's those garden focaccias that you're seeing all over the internet, the breads that people are making, the DIY projects, the book clubs is some of it, right? A way of like connecting with other people and kind of pushing yourself intellectually. And victory
some of the places doing alcohol delivery now are just giving you the kit to make it yourself at home, right?
Yes,
where you're actually constructing a drink.
Exactly. And that's giving you the time away from screens to craft something that you can be proud of and have autonomy over. It's hitting, actually those cocktail kits are hitting on all of those needs, especially if you're sharing the cocktail with somebody else.
Maybe we'll see a return to origami or something.
Yeah, maybe, who knows? But looking ahead, these desires for safety and belonging and meaning are going to be dictating all of the food and lifestyle trends that we see dominating this space. These human needs are not changing. The way that we fulfill them is going to change as we evolve, but to Jack's point, we need to be conscious of these needs when planning for the future, thinking about how is COVID affecting our ability to feel safe, our ability to belong, our ability to find meaning. How can you and your brand and your offering help people meet these needs? And that's what we really want to help you achieve.
So I think what we could do, because we are at about time, do you still have a few more minutes, Eve, or do you need to run?
Yeah.
So I can go through and see if there's any questions that missed. So if you're able to stick around, let me do an extra 5 or 6 minutes of Q&A. If not, again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with another interesting topic. But if you have a few more minutes, stick around and we'll see if we can answer some questions. As I go through this, let me ask you maybe just a couple of questions that I had as well. And I think this goes back to this notion of what it means for companies.
Yeah.
I mean, this seems very deep. I mean, and that was the point today, just get to some very root level thing.
Yeah.
Can you maybe provide an example? Like if you're a chef or someone that works in culinary R&D or marketing for a cookie brand, like how do you synthesize some of this and actually do something with it?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, that's what I help companies do all the time. So feel free and reach out to me, Eve at evecharopal.com, or if you guys have Jack's info, hit him up. We're also running original customized versions of the Hungry Study. So if people want to look at this stuff, such as their customers' anxieties or loneliness or desires for meaning, we're doing original studies with brands as well. So that's also an option. But just like on the very basic levels here, Let's say that you are working with a population that's super anxious about what it is that they're putting in their bodies. Providing really simple and transparent options for them that make them feel as though they are in the driver's seat, are agents over their own well-being, and even better if they're also being comforted by the food, if it like reminds them of something from their childhood, from home. That's a really great tactic. In terms of community, there's a lot of different ways of going about this. Either it's your brand and offerings are going to ladder back to that person's existing value system, but I am expecting that one of the things we're going to see moving forward is a reinvestment in local communities and local talent, along with heritage. And we haven't talked about the Black Lives Matter movement yet, but with the social justice movement that we are seeing, there is going to be a renewed focus on the diversity of crops, of talents, of culinary heritages that we have available to us in this country. There's a lot of exciting, really delicious stuff that we could be eating that we're not.
Yeah. I think the stat is something like 92% of our calories come from 4 plants right now.
Yeah. It's pathetic, to be honest. It's completely pathetic. It's
and
not
200,000 plants or something, right? Isn't some crazy number? And we're
even higher than that.
Higher than that.
Yeah. But we're not celebrating the terroir, the soil, the wind, the air, right? The water of our different locations. We're not celebrating the very personal identities of our creators, of our chefs or our farmers. There's so much potential here for new and exciting and innovative foods and food experiences that can set your restaurant, your food service operation apart from all of the others. And then in terms of purpose, again, I do think that there is a reckoning right now around sustainability that we have to be talking about. Yeah. All the data that I'm seeing right now is showing that people are kind of like wrapping their heads around the fact that like COVID might just be like the PG version of what will happen with the climate crisis. People are also realizing like, oh, hey, as one individual, I actually can have impact. If a bunch of people around me do the same thing, we can have a positive impact on people's well-being. And it's the same thing with sustainability. I think that anything that we can do to help people feel empowered to make a difference in the climate crisis is super, super important. And that's what we're doing at the Climate League.
So it does seem, though, in the short term that people have shifted the dialogue away from climate and it's all about COVID and safety.
Yes.
And they do work a little bit in opposition. I think the example we use is, plastic straws were bad last year. Now give me a plastic straw and more plastic to wrap it in.
So this is like the thing that I get really excited about because they're actually not in opposition. Okay. So what the Climate League is working on are narratives that basically make it explicit how these things are not in opposition. So I agree within the immediate future, there's going to be less people making decisions based on altruism. People are stressed out. Yep. They're worried about their own health and well-being. They're worried about their budget. They're lonely. But eating in a climate smart way can also ladder up to those needs. So if you're talking about immune boosting, the only way for you to be serving foods that are nutrient dense and super, super flavorful are if they were grown in healthy soil. Healthy soil is also going to sequester carbon. Now, you don't have to talk to people about the fact that they're sequestering carbon because they might not be interested right now. But you could still be meeting your company's sustainability goals while meeting your customers' needs for something that's boosting their immune systems and making them feel like agents over their own health.
Yeah, I think that's why what you're doing is so important because a lot of these concepts like sequestering carbon, they feel so esoteric to the typical person. They have no idea what it means for them. And your work is, we're going to make it all about you and something you understand and can feel, and it just so happens to also be good for the environment.
Right, and also, honestly, encompassing social justice into your menu items is doing the same thing. It's increasing biodiversity, which is really important for the climate, and it's allowing people to celebrate their heritage, create a new identity for themselves, and diversifying the foods that we are eating is absolutely essential for the climate. So they're really married together. Basically, like, we can save the climate by eating really, really good food, and people need to talk about that more.
So I want to ask you one last question, then I'll let you go. And this goes back to the question we started with as we were easing into this conversation around technology. Um, is there good tech versus bad tech in terms of what people are spending time on and being addicted to? Like, can we say that reading social media posts and following up on, posting your own thing on Instagram, is that more, let's say, damaging than some other type of playing a video game or reading the news online? Or
That's a really good question. And that depends on a lot of different factors. What I can tell you is that there is a way to use social media productively. And that is if you are using social media in order to do something offline. So if you're using social media to figure out how to bake your sourdough loaf and you want to share that with a Reddit board and get tips and tricks and be a part of that community, that's going to improve your well-being. If you're just reading the Reddit board and you don't actually make the sourdough, that's not going to help your well-being. Same thing with if you're using social media to arrange for offline meetings, though that group of people who do that, they rate the highest on well-being. So it's using social media as a conduit to offline experiences.
yeah, I think that works. It's sort of like that claw game you play, like where you push the stick around and try to get the claw, but there's a physical claw that never actually picks up the stuffed animal because it's rigged. But the idea is there's a connection there.
The important thing, though, to note is, like, right now, while we're all coping with this reality where you can't necessarily do the thing that's offline, I do think that social media is providing a necessary conduit to conversation, to a sense of belonging for a lot of people. It's just important to note that it's not going to fulfill all of your belonging needs.
I feel like one of the biggest issues is, I think as people, we compare ourselves not to an objective standard, but we base ourselves relative to what other people have, right?
Yeah.
So, like, even though I think objectively, pretty much everyone is better off today than they were 500 years ago, like, you feel like you might have less than the person next to you or something.
Yes.
And social media amplifies that because it's an unrealistic depiction of the world. You just see people on yachts all day long. They're not really on yachts all day long. You just sort of think they are. They're like, how come I'm not on my yacht? And you start feeling crappy about yourself.
Exactly, but right now no one's on their yacht. Well, that's not true. Chrissy Teigen's on her yacht. I saw it yesterday, and
she is on her yacht. Yeah.
I thought, darn, that looks good.
That makes me feel a little bit worse about myself when I hear that. Like, I don't want to be on a yacht on a Wednesday, but
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think this is a natural end for us. Eve, I can't thank you enough, and thank you to everyone for jumping in. Eve is the first outsider that we brought outside speaker we brought into this session, and she really is fantastic. Again, check out her Hungry book. You can get it on, is Amazon the preferred place to?
You can,
your website is the best place to go, thehungrybook.com, right?
Yeah, and that'll give you links to if you want to buy it at your local bookstore, or I think there's also.
Do not go to Amazon. Go to thehungrybook.com and get it directly from the author, and you can get the Hungry Study there as well. So,
yep, exactly.
Thanks, everybody. See you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Eve. Bye-bye.
Jack.
All right, Eve, I'll see you soon.